I thought you might return. Now, where were we? I told you about the folly of Aristagoras and the great king's wrath. There was Themistocles, the defense of Greece, and the rise of Athens. Ah yes, Brasidas and Lysander, and the great war that tore Greece apart. My, we really did cover quite a lot. Perhaps this time I'll stick to a single subject. While the Greeks squabbled endlessly, to their north there lay the entirely unremarkable kingdom of Macedon, a poor, rugged land, its borders beset by belligerent neighbours and riven from within by feuding nobles. For centuries, the kings of Macedon had done all they could just to hold this fragile fiefdom together. Glorious expansion was out of the question. All this changed when Philip took the throne. His was an improbable kingship. The crown only passed to Philip after both of his older brothers had their turns on the throne cut short. One slain in battle, and the other by an assassin's blade. Determined not to meet the same fate, Philip immediately set to reforming the Macedonian military, arming his soldiers with pikes as long as 4 men laid head to toe. As for those troublesome nobles, the prospect of prize commands in Philip's new army provided a tempting incentive to good behavior. When Philip marched against the Scythians, his eyes set on yet more plunder to feed his growing realm. There was a new commander among his forces, his teenage heir, Alexander. A boy of little experience, but tremendous ambitions. Philip was about to give his son a first, alluring taste of glory. Alexander had certainly enjoyed an upbringing to match his grandiose ambitions. His tutor had been none other than the great philosopher, Aristotle. Aristotle taught him political theory, ethics, rhetoric, music, science, mathematics, but above all else, it was Homer's Iliad that entranced the young prince, the epic tale of Achilles' wrath. When Alexander was still a boy, a horse trader presented a hot-blooded stallion to Philip's court. It was a magnificent animal, its coat a shining black with a white mark like a star upon its head. None of the fine horsemen of Macedon could tame the beast. Until, that is, the boy Alexander realized that the horse was afraid of its own shadow and turned it towards the sun. Alexander named the steed Bucephalus, and from that day forth the two were bonded like brothers. Now sat proudly astride his mount, Alexander accompanied his victorious father on the road home to Macedon, through the rocky territory of the Triballi. It was to prove an eventful journey. On campaign with his father, Alexander had finally been given the chance to prove himself. Things were not always so harmonious between father and son. Alexander's fiercely protective mother Olympias was not Philip's only wife, nor was she a full-blooded Macedonian. At the wedding feast for Philip's 7th wife, the girl's father proposed a toast.
May the gods bless this union, and may it produce a legitimate Macedonian heir.
And what am I then? A bastard?
Philip rose, drew his sword, and advanced. Not on the man who had insulted his son, but against Alexander. Thoroughly drunk, the one-eyed conqueror tripped and fell flat on his face.
Here is the man who would lead you from Europe into Asia. and he can't even cross from one couch to the next!
Yet for every quarrel, there was a reconciliation. And Alexander once again rode at his father's side as Philip bore down on Greece. Philip had long wished to be master of the Greek world, and the wily campaigner had used all manner of diplomatic tricks to extend his influence to the south. For years, an uneasy peace abided. But now, the Greeks prepared to make one last stand against their would-be conqueror. Astride the road to Chaeronea, the Greek forces waited. On their right, the Athenians, their empire long diminished but their pride irrepressible. On their left, the Thebans, among their ranks the elite sacred band. From the north, their long pikes swaying above storms of dust, came the Macedonians. And on their flank, with full command of the king's finest cavalry, was Alexander. At Chaeronea, amid the bodies skewered by pikes and mangled by swords, the city-states of Greece had their hopes of independence trampled into the mud. Philip could finally turn his gaze eastwards, to his long-held ambition of plundering the rich Persian Empire. His hopes, however, were suddenly and brutally snuffed out. An assassin's blade jammed fiercely between Philip's ribs. The Lion of Macedon bled out in the dust, a fate he had brought upon so many others. And so it came to pass that Alexander, nearly 20 summers of age, ascended to the throne of Macedon. The nobles swore him fealty, some gladly, some reluctantly, some out of duty and some out of calculation. Some were never given the choice, struck down on the new king's orders before they could cause trouble. Assassination, you see, was something of a staple of Macedonian politics. Equally routine was the propensity of Macedon's northern neighbors to invade whenever a king died, like jackals converging on a fresh carcass when a lion has moved away. The gleaming diadem of royalty set freshly upon his brow, Alexander marched north, where the first true test of his reign awaited. Not all of the northern tribes were foolish enough to pick a fight with Alexander. Like a keen-eyed jeweler, able to discern the potential in a rough and unshaped stone, King Langaros of the Agrianians chose to ingratiate himself with the Macedonian monarch. Langaros informed Alexander that a tribe known as the Autariatai were planning to attack the Macedonians, and even more helpfully, Langaros offered to deal with them himself. Alexander gladly accepted. And so, from every hamlet and township in the Strymon Valley, Langaros called upon his forces. Swift peltasts, clutching their throwing spears tight, cavalrymen atop hardy horses well used to cantering through rocky hills, stout infantrymen armed with that wicked long blade, the Rhomphaia. To ensure their commitment, Langaros spoke to them of duty. To bolster their fortitude, he invoked the gods. But to strengthen their zeal, Langaros promised them plunder. While Alexander had been away in the north, making friends and slaughtering foes, rumors were spreading in Greece.
I have it on good authority that the tyrant Alexander is dead. and with him that feckless rabble that his barbarous father called an army. Now is the time to rise up, cast out the garrisons that he imposed on your 5 cities, and retake your liberty!
Alexander was not dead. And when he heard that the Thebans had trapped their Macedonian garrison on the city's acropolis, he was furious. Ah, Thebes. The city where Oedipus had plucked out his own eyes, where Antigone hanged herself, where Heracles went mad and slew his own family. For defying Alexander, the Thebans would suffer a new tragedy. Alexander's destruction of Thebes was near total. All that he allowed to remain were the temples, the ancient Cadmea, and the house of the poet Pindar. The rest of the rebellious Greeks immediately surrendered, and Alexander could once again turn his gaze towards Persia. As was only natural before such a grand expedition, Alexander went to Delphi, seeking the wisdom of the god Apollo. When Alexander arrived, he was told that Apollo's priestess was absent from the temple, this being a day when prophecies were forbidden. But Alexander, believing that his will surpassed any sacred rules, marched to the priestess's quarters and began to drag her towards the temple, determined that she would tell him his fate. "My son!" exclaimed the terrified priestess. "You are unconquerable!" Satisfied with his boorishly acquired prophecy, Alexander crossed the Hellespont. Parmenion was waiting with the advance guard, but Alexander had more pressing matters. He proceeded to Troy, where he anointed the gravestone of Achilles with oil. He and his friends ran races around the tomb, as though they were the heroes of Homer's Iliad. The Persians had time for no such frivolities. They assembled their forces at the river Granicus, trusting in its steep banks and fast-flowing waters to deter Alexander's onslaught. Alexander gazed at the army arrayed against him, a host more numerous than any he had yet faced. The steeds of the Persian nobles strutting along the serried ranks, their riders eagerly watching for a glimpse of the invader they wished to slay. Upon a single charge across the Granicus, Alexander would stake the fate of his entire expedition. Like the kings of Homer's Iliad, vying for glory in the foremost ranks, Macedonian monarchs led from the front, and few with such zeal as Alexander. At the Granicus he plunged into the fray, as a famished wolf darts among a grazing flock, tearing at sheep and shepherd alike. But Alexander ventured too far, and a Persian horseman brought his sword swinging towards the king's neck. But Clytus, lurching forward, sliced the Persian's arm from his shoulder. His first victory over the Mede in hand, and feeling just as invincible as the Pythian priestess had proclaimed him, Alexander marched on. His target was the coastal city of Halicarnassus, its grand harbor ringed by walls flecked with sea foam, where the great warrior queen Artemisia had once ruled. You see, Alexander had a rather unconventional plan to deal with the Persian navy. Rather than build a fleet and fight them at sea, he'd simply use his army to capture the Persian naval bases, one by one. The rightful queen of Halicarnassus was Ada II, a wise and learned woman, and a gracious benefactor of the temple at Delphi. But, deposed by her brother, Ada now languished in exile, until the arrival of Alexander presented her with an opportunity. The exiled queen welcomed Alexander, putting her wealth, her followers, and her considerable knowledge at his disposal. So splendidly did they get along, Ada even adopted Alexander as her own son. The siege of Halicarnassus, then, would be a family affair. Breaching Halicarnassus was a tremendous feat, as had been the victory at the Granicus, not to mention the slew of cities throughout Asia Minor that had surrendered without a fight. Yet the victory Alexander truly craved remained elusive. He set off once more, seeking a confrontation with the Persian king Darius III, named after the very monarch who had launched the first Persian invasion of Greece. Along the way, Alexander came upon the town of Gordion. Here, there was an ancient cart tied to a post by the most fiendishly intricate knot, a tangled mass of ancient cords twisting, snaking, weaving, slipping over and under and around a knot with no visible beginning or end. Not a very interesting attraction, you might think, but it was said that whoever could undo the knot would rule the world. Alexander examined the knot, paused for thought. Then with a single stroke of his sword, simply sliced it in two. From there, Alexander proceeded south, until he reached Cilicia. He began to feel a frightful heat rising in his breast. Then he broke into a wild sweat, frothing like a raging stallion. He flung himself into the icy cold waters of the river Kidnus, but emerged racked with cramps and fever. All of the king's physicians feared to administer a remedy. What dreadful tortures would await them if they failed, or worsened the king's condition? Only one, Philip of Acarnania, was willing to produce a cure. But as Alexander was about to raise the potion to his lips, a messenger passed him a letter from Parmenion, claiming that the Persian king had paid the doctor to poison him. Alexander looked the physician straight in the eye, and downed the cup in one go. At first, the king fell back, his breath lost, swooning into near unconsciousness. But then, as Philip attended to him, Alexander regained his senses and felt the cure work its way through his body. A period of rest was clearly in order. Alexander and his men, welcomed into the cities of Lower Cilicia, at last paused their relentless march. So confident was Darius that he would triumph at Issus, he had brought his mother, wife, and daughters to the battle. So hastily did he flee, they were left behind for Alexander to capture. Like the women of Troy, powerless before their captors, Darius's family wept and lamented, imagining that their lot would now be misery and servitude. But Alexander treated them with perfect respect, and allowed them every comfort to which they were accustomed. Alexander proceeded along the coast, until he came to Tyre, that great city of the Phoenicians, set upon an offshore island as though the whole marvelous edifice floated on the sea. Alexander demanded entry to Tyre, wishing to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart. The Tyrians refused, and when Alexander sent messengers a second time, they were hurled into the sea from the city walls. An outrageous thing to do. But the Tyrians, their grand fortifications protected by the waves that lapped up against them, held the entirely reasonable expectation that Alexander would give up and move on. Alexander rarely did what you and I might consider reasonable. And so, work began on a vast causeway, a bridge of earth and rubble between Tyre and the mainland. The world reshaped at Alexander's command. The Tyrians paid an awful price for defying Alexander. Thousands were slaughtered in the city. Thousands more crucified along the beach. The rest sold into slavery, condemned like the women of Troy to know ever after that once they had ruled a great city by the shore. In Egypt, Alexander received a more favorable reception. The Egyptians had always chafed under Persian rule, and so when Alexander arrived, they hailed him as a liberator. They proclaimed him Pharaoh, the incarnation of Ra, and Alexander blessed his new subjects with a magnificent city, Alexandria, crowning the rich Nile Valley. Having seized the jewel of Darius' empire, Alexander turned once more to defeating his rival in battle. Darius sent messenger after messenger, desperately suing for peace.
30,000 talents of silver. All the territory west of the Euphrates. Co-rulership of the Achaemenid Empire.
If I were you, I would accept.
So would I, if I were Parmenion.
His final offer rejected, Darius gathered an army once more. They awaited Alexander at Gaugamela, arrayed in their thousands upon a grim and dusty plain. The great king ordered the place cleared of any vegetation, so that his vicious scythed chariots would have no obstacle between them and their prey. On the eve of battle, beneath the indifferent stars, the armies of Darius and Alexander slept fitfully, knowing that on the morrow they would decide the fate of empires. Alexander was determined that Darius would not get away from him a second time. Over jagged hills and shifting dunes, Alexander chased the great king, urging his swift riders on through freezing desert nights and days cruelly elongated by the summer sun. But when Alexander finally caught up with his foe, Darius lay dying. In the dirt, amidst upturned wagons and mules broken from exhaustion, the great king of Persia bled out, murdered by his own men. Alexander had Darius' body cleaned and dressed, and returned to his mother. And so, a mere 5 years after he inherited the crown of Macedon, Alexander seized the diadem of Persia, a king of kings, to be sure. The killers of Darius he hunted down. The cities that resisted his rule he stormed. But in truth, most of the Persian governing class willingly exchanged one king for another. Power such as Alexander now possessed is rarely left untroubled. Alexander caught word of a plot to kill him, hatched within his own court. The would-be assassins were rounded up and executed. Among them, Philotas, son of Parmenion. Philotas had known of the conspiracy, but said nothing. A crime, Alexander declared, as heinous as the plot itself. But what of Parmenion? The moment he learned that his son had been executed, he would be sure to act. And he had thousands of loyal men beneath him. No, he too would have to die.
Armed and belted men in my tent. So, he's finally decided to do away with me.
Will you resist, sir?
No, I won't. But tell the boy king this. The gods cannot abide excess.
Alexander founded many cities that bore his name. This one he named Alexandria Escate, meaning the furthest. Here, on the edge of the known world, beset by foes and vexed by the barren landscape, Alexander raised his improbable city, an attestation that every last parasang of the Persian Empire was his to order. Yet beyond the borders of the empire he had just conquered, there were lands vaster and richer than even the sprawling Persian realm. India, a place little understood by the Greeks, who traded tales of a land where giant ants dug for gold in the rich hillsides, where rivers of honey flowed from rocks, where men lived 100 or even 200 years, untroubled by pains. They spoke of men with one giant foot, with which they sheltered themselves from the sun, men with the heads of dogs, and men with no heads at all, who had their faces in their chests. I shall let you decide the veracity of these stories for yourself. In one respect, though, the land of the 5 rivers was much like anywhere else. It was endlessly contested by rival kings. On one side of the river Hydaspes lay the realm of Takshila, ruled by the young king Ambi, who had recently gained the throne after his father was murdered. On the other side of the Hydaspes, another king ruled, Horus, the man who had recently murdered Ambi's father. This being as good a pretext as any for another round of fighting, the 2 kings gathered their armies, made extravagant promises to their mercenaries, and prepared to wage war. Back at the court of Alexander, things grew fractious. Now that he was king of Persia, Alexander was beginning to adopt Persian customs, including the practice of prostration before the king. To many of Alexander's Greek and Macedonian followers, this gesture seemed not only servile, but blasphemous, an honor reserved solely for the gods. At a banquet, Clitus, ever the straight-talker, confronted the king. Both men were deeply drunk.
What is this, Alexander? You dress in foreign finery. You consult with eunuchs and magi. If a Macedonian wants an audience with you, he has to beg it from some pompous Persian courtier, and then prostrate himself like a slave. Have you forsaken your own kinsman?
Shut your wretched mouth, Clitus. If it weren't for me, you'd be fending off Thracian goat thieves from some hillside hovel.
No! If it weren't for your father, you'd have no army, no victories, no glory. Without your father, you would be nothing. And if he could see you now, he'd be ashamed.
Alexander wrenched a spear from a nearby guard, hurled it across the room, and struck Clitus dead. Alexander looked upon the lifeless face of the man he had once called friend, the man who had saved his life at the Granicus, and Alexander wept. All through the night, all through the following day, his grief tortured him. A procession of friends and comrades, courtiers and flatterers, philosophers and wise men came to him, trying to soothe his guilty soul. But what roused him from his melancholy was a force greater, deeper than any grief: his yearning. India awaited. A chance not just for conquest, but to follow in the footsteps of the god Dionysus, to witness marvels unseen by any Greek, to reach the outer sea that girdled the earth itself. Unlike Darius, Porus did not flee. He fought on, even as his army routed and his elephants were dragged shrieking to the ground. At last, worn out by wounds, Porus was captured and brought before his foe.
Tell me, how do you wish to be treated?
Like a king.
Admiring Porus's strength and nobility, Alexander not only spared him, he made him the latest satrap of his ever-expanding empire. Alexander gained one friend that day, but he lost another.
His wounds were too great, my lord.
No. He has overcome worse than this.
We all have our limits, sire.
As ever, there was only one thing that could assuage Alexander's troubled soul: action. His new ally, Porus, was quick to suggest a suitable target for Alexander's next conquest. His own enemies, a warlike tribe known as the Cathaeans. And so the Macedonians prepared to march again. It had been 8 years since they set out from home. They had won innumerable battles, founded cities, plundered more wealth than any man would know what to do with. Yet still they were driven on by their insatiable king. And so the men began to wonder, would they ever return home to enjoy their spoils and sire children to hear their stories? Or would Alexander push them on until they collapsed?
I have heard rumors, men, that your conviction is faltering. That some among you wish to turn back and leave our conquest incomplete. Do you not know what lies beyond this river? Lands lusher than you have ever seen. Riches that Croesus would envy. Glory, oh what glory, to rival Heracles himself! Silence! Speak, someone, I am no tyrant.
We love you, Alexander. Truly we do. But we want to go home.
East is the Ganges, which empties into the great sea that girdles the earth and will bear us back to Macedon. East is the way, east we shall go.
But still the silence persisted. The men refused to go on. Like Achilles sulking at Troy, Alexander withdrew to his tent. For 2 days, he spoke to no one, his heart filled with terrible rage. Armies are fickle. Perhaps the men would reconsider their refusal, whether from shame, or fear, or duty. Or perhaps the gods who had shown Alexander such favor would send a sign that none could ignore. No such portent came, nor did the army's grief turn to compliance. And so Alexander at last agreed to take them home. But, as you might expect, he wasn't simply going to take them back the way they came. They would build ships, sail down the Hydaspes until it joined with the river Indus, and then onto the sea. Any who stood in their path they would conquer, filling the glittering river with bloated corpses.
Alexander! Alexander! The arrow is stuck in his lung! Fetch the physician!
No, Perdiccas! Cut it out of me! Now, man!
Alexander's body was by now as scarred and slashed as a butcher's block, and this new wound was the deepest yet. Perhaps, having escaped death once again, he ought to have considered a reduction in his adventuring. On the contrary, it only reinforced his sense of invincibility. When he reached the southern coast, Alexander announced that the bulk of his army would not be sailing home. Rather, they would trek through the vast Gedrosian desert. The fleet was put under the command of Niarchos, with orders to sail along the coast and rendezvous at Babylon. And so the admiral made ready. The ships were loaded with barley cakes and wineskins, nets and fishing lines, chests of gold should there be opportunities for trade, and racks of spears should they need to fight. In addition to the steersmen and sailors, the carpenters and soldiers, there were also geographers, botanists and naturalists, eagerly crowding the decks for a sight of something new and marvelous. For this, you see, would be a voyage of discovery. Alexander's march through the desert had taken a terrible toll. The sands had swallowed countless men, their strength sapped by disease or thirst or long festering wounds. Why confront the desert? To claim the glory of overcoming it? Or to punish the army that had refused to indulge his ambitions? Only the gods know now. And there were graver losses yet to come.
Not you, Hephaestion. Anyone but you.
I would have followed you to the ends of the earth, Alexander.
As Achilles grieved for Patroclus, so Alexander grieved for Hephaestion. An epic anguish. Biting sorrow mingled with thundering rage. Like a storm cloud, gathering up its fierce energy as it rolls across the darkening sky, Alexander convulsed with wrath that demanded release. His black gaze fell upon the Chasseans, who dwelt among the craggy mountains of the Zagros. In baneful silence, the great conqueror led his men into the hills for the final time. Like Heracles, driven mad by Hera's hand, Alexander slaughtered the Chasseans without pity, soaking the hills crimson. And then, sated, he was alone once more. Hephaestion, Clytus, Bucephalus, Parmenion, they had all crossed the Styx. And how many brave men besides? How many soldiers had left Macedon as keen-eyed youths, only to heave their last breaths on some distant, desolate plain? At last Alexander, who had seen so much death, confronted it himself. Some spoke of disease, others of poison. Perhaps the many wounds finally wore him down, or the drink, or the grief. Even the greatest have their limits.
You must choose a successor, Alexander. To whom will the kingdom pass?
To the strongest.
And with that, the mighty heart stilled. Bereft, filled with sorrow and regret, his dreams of world conquest thwarted, the blazing star burnt out. But how brightly it had shone. He was too much for this world. Too spirited, too ambitious, too bold. Should he really be faulted for that? As for the empire he forged, well, as you might expect, bequeathing your realm to the strongest is hardly conducive to a smooth transition of power. Alexander's generals immediately set to fighting one another, pulling the empire apart like stray dogs tearing at a hunk of meat. No empire would ever be so rapidly gained, or so suddenly shattered. Let me rest my tired voice now, and then I shall tell you of another empire, one that rose slowly, patiently, relentlessly, and endured.